Kizamde! Hop on the beat!
For the past 7 years on this channel, I've spent a lot of time addressing the perceived plot holes in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Now, the nature of these Araki Forgot topics range from misreadings of the source material to ideas based off of common misinformation spread throughout the fandom. And the topics also differ from simple small misunderstandings to decade-long debates among fans. Out of all of the Araki Forgot topics, however, I think the one that is perhaps the most discussed and the most representative of Araki Forgot as a whole would be the debacle around DIO's Coffin. Of course, this is referring to DIO's return as a main villain after 100 years in Stardust Crusaders, when he was said to have remained on the ocean floor inside of a coffin until being discovered by treasure hunters. The problems that people have with this plot point are actually quite complex and aren't at all limited to one angle of discussion. People take issue with how DIO got in the coffin, how the coffin was trapped underwater, how Erina managed to occupy the same coffin for a time, and some ask if it's even the same coffin to begin with. Now, I've pretty thoroughly discussed this topic already across many of my Debunking Araki Forgot videos, but the question of DIO's coffin has nevertheless remained a common point of debate that I doubt will ever go away. I find the whole thing pretty fascinating, especially with how the arguments have evolved over the years. So here I want to compile and walk through every possible point in one place, so I can hopefully put together my definitive argument against DIO's coffin being a plot hole. But first, I'd like to thank this video's sponsor, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit. JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Golden Spirit is a new mobile game based on the JoJo anime series. You can put together a team of your favorite JoJo characters from parts 1 to 6 to participate in strategic RPG battles, all within an accurate portrayal of the JoJo anime's art style. You can upgrade and customize your team of JoJo fighters across multiple game modes, and team up with your friends to help each other out in cooperative challenges. The game officially launches today on the App Store and Google Play. To coincide with the launch, a special summoning event for a super rare Jotaro Kujo unit is now available. Here you can play through a recreation of Jotaro's journey in Stardust Crusaders, and complete activities to earn exclusive in-game rewards. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to download the game now and participate in the launch event. And now, back to the video. Perhaps the first question we should discuss is why DIO's coffin stands out as such a big topic. I personally wouldn't consider it nearly as convoluted as something like King Crimson or the Heaven Plan of later parts. In fact, I think with what we know about the coffin, it's remarkably simple. I think the main reason this topic is so common is because it's really the first big potential plot hole that people are going to encounter. Now, of course, plenty of people claim aspects of Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency are plot holes. I've done entire videos covering them before. But those are really more on a case-by-case basis of blatant misreadings of the story. They only really exist as a result of the whole Araki Forgot idea spiraling out of control, where now people will comb through the series with the purpose of finding plot holes. Which I may add they do quite poorly since most of them are easily debunked. Whereas when the average person with a normal reading or watching experience gets to the start of part 3, I think the coffin is going to be the first real eyebrow-raising moment they'll experience. And I do think it's fairly understandable to be confused in the moment if you don't have a great memory of what went on at the end of part 1. And as I'll go over, the issue is only further amplified by some common mistranslations, differences between the manga and anime, and the already existing discourse surrounding the topic. Before I get into people's main issues with DIO's coffin, I'm going to walk through a basic chain of events that I think we can all agree on. And even if you take issue with the implementation of the coffin plot point, I think this basic framework is undeniably what the story is trying to tell. As a severed head following his battle with Jonathan, DIO had the coffin brought on board the ship while hiding inside it to attempt to steal Jonathan's body. After Jonathan caused the ship to begin to explode, DIO planned to take over Jonathan and then escape the explosion by hiding in the coffin. Part 1 ends by showing us Jonathan holding DIO back as Erina and the infant Lisa enter the coffin and escape the ship. According to Stardust Crusaders, there is a hidden compartment inside the coffin. DIO managed to steal Jonathan's body and then entered the coffin's compartment to escape. After Erina was rescued, the coffin sank to the bottom of the ocean where it remained for close to 100 years until it was discovered and DIO escaped. Now, of course, the most obvious issue people have is how Dio could possibly occupy the same coffin that Erina used to escape. In an effort to explain this, some people have posited that there was actually a second coffin on board the ship which Dio entered to escape. And this explanation has become widespread enough that a decent number of people still believe it to this day. I addressed this in my original Part 3 debunking video by pointing out that nothing that ever supports the existence of a second coffin exists in the story. And I explained that it was instead Dio entering a second compartment of the same coffin. In response to that, I got a lot of people saying that the compartment theory doesn't make sense. However, I feel like I must stress that there is no theory of there being a compartment. The coffin having a second compartment is explicitly spelled out in the story. However, many of the early fan translations misinterpret or omit this information completely. So here I've provided the official English manga translation, as well as the anime's subtitles, which plainly state that there is a second compartment. So the existence of a second coffin is unsupported. So how exactly does the second compartment function? Well, we can actually physically see it. We see that the main compartment where Erina was hiding is lined in a red cushion. At the beginning of Part 3, we see that the red cushion is actually a false bottom, and it can be lifted to reveal a second compartment underneath it. This is the one that Dio hid inside of. I would say the main point of contention comes from how Dio managed to enter the coffin without Erina noticing, or vice versa. Now, despite a lot of people arguing very definitively from either side of this topic, I feel like I need to point out that the coffin scene in the original Part 1 manga leaves a ton to the imagination. Of course, we aren't shown Dio entering the coffin, since that's a twist revealed in Part 3, but we never actually see Erina enter it either. The manga shows Jonathan telling Erina to escape with the baby, and then dying while holding Dio's head. After this we see an explosion, and then a burst of fire with the opened coffin in the foreground. Then we see the ship from the outside completely exploding, and finally we see Erina open the coffin on the ocean's surface. So we technically do not actually know if Dio or Erina entered it first. Since we know what compartment they were each in, we can reason what would be the easier explanation. If Dio entered it first and was hidden in the second compartment, then Erina could easily get into the top portion without seeing Dio. However, the framing of the scene could also imply that it's the other way around, since Jonathan tells Erina to escape first. So it's possible that she entered the coffin, and that Dio had to enter the second compartment after her. While the first explanation is definitely easier, I do think both of these are possible. Regarding the first explanation, which is the one I would consider cleaner, many have argued against Dio entering the coffin first by saying that there was no way he could have gotten to it before her. But with the smoke and explosions going off throughout the ship, I think it's definitely possible. Also, we should note that Jonathan never actually told Erina to get into the coffin specifically. The information about the coffin being safe actually comes from Dio's dialogue, so it's also possible that Erina would have looked for some other method of escape before coming back to the coffin, in which time Dio could have entered it. As for the other way, a lot of people have argued it's impossible for Dio to reach the false bottom without Erina seeing him. I've argued in the past that the coffin may also possess a trapdoor to enter the second compartment directly, although that's kind of a sloppy argument since it's just an assumption of an extra function of the coffin that we don't know about. The way I think it still makes sense though is if Dio were to open the lid and the top layer of the coffin at the same time and keep them flush as he closed and enter it, or that these two portions can latch together for the purpose of entering the second compartment from the outside. That makes a lot more sense than an additional door. And with Erina sealed inside the top portion, the motion of it opening would again be disguised by the rocking of the boat and the destruction going on outside. But I would argue that's all ultimately unnecessary since I've come to find that Dio entering the coffin first is the more likely scenario. Now, a lot of people have argued that Dio had no possible opportunity to enter the coffin at all. I've gotten many comments saying that the manga or anime shows Dio being consumed by the explosion before getting inside, making the fact that he got in a blatant plot hole. However, I have to again point out the vague nature of the original scene. We do see an explosion occur near Dio and Jonathan, and later on that page, we see the ship completely destroyed. But this is not necessarily the same explosion that destroyed the ship. Explosions had been going off already throughout the scenes before this, so this would be a case of misdirection. When you read this page, it appears that the boat was instantly destroyed and everything was lost. But then after that, you see the coffin on the ocean, revealing that Erina had gotten inside. This is the point where I think the anime and manga's differences cause an issue, since the scene is obviously going to feel differently paced in the anime, which is supposed to be playing out in somewhat real time. Whereas in a manga, you don't actually know what the amount of time between panels is. One major detail in the manga that I think proves this explosion is not the one that destroyed the ship is the fact that on this page, the coffin is open. Despite the coffin being open, we can't see anyone inside of it yet. Although it is drawn from a low angle, and it's possible that Erina could be inside it already. But I would argue that the coffin definitely had to have been closed already to protect Erina from the final explosion, meaning this panel happened sometime before that. So in between the panel on the bottom right and the big image of the ship exploding, one or both of them entered the coffin and it was shut. In the anime, however, this same sequence of events depicts the coffin as having already been closed, implying that Erina is already inside. And with this moment playing out across seconds, it makes the potential gap in time less apparent. As always, I'm going to side with the manga as the more definitive version of the scene, since this is the one directly created by Araki. So based on that, I think that there's a clear gap that is intentionally not shown to the reader, during which Erina and Dio entered the coffin. On top of that, some have argued that Dio would not have had the time to take over Jonathan's body before the ship explodes. I find this argument really sloppy since we have no frame of reference whatsoever for how long this would actually take. The fact is that Dio taking over Jonathan's body happens off-screen and we don't exactly know what the process entails. In my reading of it, it's simply that Dio would sever the head and then place his head on the next stump and use his tendrils throughout the body to puppet it. Now obviously Dio is able to make a more seamless connection between them like we see later, which I could believe he would take some time to acclimate to, but I think in the moment he would still have some indirect control over the body and be able to enter the coffin. In a very similar example, SCDC was able to control a new arm after adding it to his body almost immediately. Of course, that's a pillar man, so he'd be stronger, but the process shouldn't really be so different. As is common with Araki Forgot topics, there's also the fact that in an attempt to take apart a scene and look for plot holes, they often end up contradicting themselves. In the previous point, I went over them saying that Dio was too weak to be able to enter the coffin with the body, but the same people will go on to make the contradictory argument of asking why Dio couldn't use his vampire abilities to kill Erina, or to later escape from the ocean floor. Like I said a minute ago, my position is that Dio has some rudimentary control over Jonathan, but that he couldn't manage to do much more than enter the coffin. He could have either lacked the strength to attack Erina or lost consciousness entirely after exerting the power to enter the coffin in the first place. This next one isn't a common point, but I find it really funny, so I want to include it here. I've gotten multiple comments saying that Erina escaping in the coffin shouldn't be possible, since it would be too heavy for her to lift it. Apparently they believe that Erina picked up the coffin and carried it above deck to use it to escape. This idea is so utterly ridiculous, I have to wonder how anyone can even believe it. Obviously Erina didn't move the coffin, she simply got inside, and the coffin withstood the explosion and was protected as the ship was destroyed around it. Some people raise more issues when it comes to the fate of the coffin after Erina's escape. I've gotten many comments asking how it's possible for Erina to have been rescued, but for the coffin to nevertheless end up on the bottom of the ocean afterwards. Some comments have asked why when Erina washed up on a beach somewhere, she would bother pushing the coffin back into the ocean. This is one of those blatant misreading Araki Forgots I mentioned earlier. Since Erina didn't wash up on a beach, she was rescued at sea by a boat. According to the manga, she was rescued 2 days later off the coast of the Canary Islands. The final 2-page spread of the manga actually shows Erina in the ocean with a boat visible in the distance. However, this page was actually added later, and the original ending of the manga is the big page with everyone's faces on it. But regardless, they both support her being rescued at sea. Others ask why when Erina was rescued, Dio didn't use that opportunity to make an escape. As I argued earlier, I think Dio was too weak at this point to escape and wouldn't regain his strength until being able to get more blood like he did from the sailors in part 3. However, I think a much more important detail is the fact that Erina was very likely to have been rescued in daylight. In a time without widespread electricity, I don't think Erina could have been spotted from a boat in the dark. Since the rescue would have happened during the day, Dio couldn't have possibly exited the coffin without dying in sunlight. Others have asked why when the coffin was removed from the water, it would simply be dumped back in, since they argue that the sailors would maybe want to keep the ornate coffin. However, this is assuming they somehow lifted the coffin to begin with. I feel it's far more likely they lowered down a ladder or would send out a rowboat to pick Erina up, rather than precariously dangle a woman and baby with a crane. I've even gotten a comment before suggesting that Erina would have needed to keep the coffin to sell since she had lost Jonathan, from a person seemingly forgetting that Erina herself was rich to begin with and is already the sole heiress to the Joestar's fortune. Really, the most likely scenario is that the coffin would be left behind with Erina's rescue, and eventually sink to the bottom on its own. Another point of contention comes from the coffin being locked in Part 3. I've gotten a ton of comments telling me that the fact that the coffin is locked is a blatant plot hole, since Erina would have had no reason to lock it, with many pointing to a padlock being visible on the outside of the coffin. Again, this one comes down to some differences between the manga and anime. In the manga, the only time a padlock ever appears on the coffin is in Part 1, when Father Stick sees an unlocked padlock and discovers that the coffin is locked from the inside. Later in Part 3, the sailors reiterate that the coffin is locked from the inside, so at no point in the Part 3 manga is a padlock ever visible, so this detail is only present in the anime and is a mistake. Looking at things from a more meta point of view, some point to the coffin as an obvious example of retconning. A retcon, or retroactive continuity, is a literary device where something that previously happened in a story is changed by the addition of new information later. So the argument is that originally, Jonathan and Dio were destroyed by the boat explosion, and the fact that Dio survived was not considered at all until the start of Part 3. Now, whether this is a blatant retcon or not, I'll be getting to in a minute, but I feel like I just have a fundamental disagreement with some people on this. I feel like people have become so plot hole brained in recent years, so I have to point out that the existence of a retcon is not an inherent flaw in a story. Practically every sequel or continuation to a story that has ever existed is going to contain a retcon in some form. No long-running series has ever been fully set in stone from the beginning, and JoJo is absolutely full of retcons. For instance, Josuke. Araki originally didn't even intend to make Part 4 and wanted to end with 3, but when he chose to write it, he then created the idea of Josuke having been Joseph's illegitimate child. Nothing in the story existed up to that point to foreshadow Josuke's existence. He was invented on the spot for the purposes of Part 4's story. And the same is true for many other things. Stand abilities didn't exist before Part 3. The stand arrow didn't exist before Part 4. The origin of the stand arrows didn't exist until Part 5. And Jolene, Pucci, and his plan that he had been working on in the background this whole time didn't exist until Part 6. So I feel like it should be obvious that a retcon existing doesn't make it a plot hole, or a necessarily negative addition to the story. As for the coffin, at face value I would consider it a form of retconning, but we do actually have some information that contradicts that idea. Araki has stated that his original plan for JoJo was to end with 3 parts. He chose to have Dio defeated in Part 1 and then planned for him to return later, but he didn't want him to come back right away, so he chose to write Part 2 in the middle. So this is evidence that Araki intended Dio to come back all along. Of course, the form in which Dio would return may not have been completely considered, but you have to remember that this is a weekly manga. 1 week after Part 1 ended, Part 2 began. So if he created Part 2 in the first place to serve as a gap before Dio's return, then he certainly already had the idea of him returning while writing the end of Part 1. And so the vague nature of the coffin scene, as I discussed before, could be a very intentional part of that. Dio's return was a secret to the reader, and so the scene is presented in a way that at face value makes it appear that Dio was defeated, but enough information is left out that allows the blanks to be filled in with his return later. One more thing I want to cover is some of the additions to the coffin argument that were made by supplementary material, since the scenes surrounding Erina in the coffin were actually adapted into 2 separate JoJo light novels. Now, let me just preface this by saying that this is spin-off material. Araki isn't involved in the writing of the JoJo light novels, and in fact we have learned through interviews that he is almost completely hands-off when it comes to the creative process of the spin-offs. He allows and even encourages the author to do their own thing completely, even if it conflicts with the original work. So we can't exactly take anything in these novels as canon, but I do think it's worth bringing up here since people often reference them when talking about Dio's coffin. The first of these is Over Heaven, written by Monogatari series creator Nisio Isin. This book is framed as being Dio's diary mentioned in Part 6, so it is written from Dio's perspective. In the final chapters of the book, written shortly before the final battle in Part 3, Dio recounts having survived the boat explosion, but is confused as to how Erina survived as well. He realizes that while he was unconscious, Erina took pity on him and put him inside the coffin to save his life. I do think this is a pretty interesting idea, and within the book itself it works. But there's simply no indication in the manga that something like this occurred, and since this was written independently of Araki, I wouldn't accept it as a real explanation of what happened. The other book to mention is George Joestar. If you know anything about this book, you know it's full of some utterly insane plot points that involve characters from all parts of JoJo crossing over. This book contains its own version of events involving the coffin, where we see that Dio reached the coffin from underwater, and Dio takes the infant Lisa hostage to force Erina to let him stay there. With how much this book goes outside of the JoJo canon and is basically a crazy AU story, I think it goes without saying that I wouldn't accept it as evidence for explaining the coffin. With that, I think I've gone over pretty much all of the main talking points when it comes to Dio's coffin. Now, I've been a JoJo fan for over 10 years at this point, and people have been talking about Dio's coffin for that entire time, and they probably have been since before I even knew what JoJo was. And despite so many arguments surrounding the coffin being debunked over the years, people still continue to find new ones. But even though many people still continue to disagree over the coffin, I consider the issue of it to be basically solved at this point. And really, the further arguing is just the last remnants of the idea kind of falling apart. Consider that the argument used to completely be about this entirely fabricated plot point of a second coffin, which a vast number of people were completely certain existed, only for that to shift completely to people not believing the second compartment exists, until it gets pointed out how it's shown in the manga, and then suddenly it's the method of entering the coffin that has become the main argument, with people then describing their own step-by-step retelling of the coffin scene and pointing out how it's contradictory, when their whole account of the scene isn't actually based on anything that appeared in the manga, which keeps it very vague. It then devolves even further into the minutiae of the coffin's design or something like Erina's rescue, which is a different topic entirely. So I would consider the plot hole of Dio's coffin to be like 99.9% debunked. It started off as this massive thing that people would point to as emblematic of Araki's poor writing skills, until it just kept shrinking in importance where now the thing we're arguing about is completely different. In that way, I think it's the idea that best represents Araki Forgot as a whole. It's something that starts off as a normal misunderstanding of the story, which can then simply be pointed out and explained. But the whole plot hole brain cinema sins culture of people don't want the story to make sense, since pointing out the inconsistencies of a story makes them feel smart. So it stops being about being confused by the story and becomes trying to prove you're smarter than the story. Although the type of people that do this typically aren't very smart, which is kind of how we get some of the funnier comments I've shown throughout this video. And I don't really think this is ever going to go away completely, although I definitely feel like the disposition of the JoJo community underwent a pretty massive shift after my video series came out, since while the topic before was very one-sided, I think the Debunking series was able to present the arguments against it in an easy format, and give more of a voice to the idea that the problems with the story are often based in blatant misreadings or misinformation. I think the sort of malicious nature of the comments has also changed over time. People used to frankly be very nasty with how they disparaged Araki's writing. It kind of went beyond having a normal misunderstanding or playfully poking fun at the bizarre aspects of the series. People were legitimately saying Araki's writing was astoundingly poor, or that JoJo's success was some kind of fluke or was only carried by the artwork. That idea has absolutely faded over time, and people now more than ever recognize how well laid out JoJo's themes are. Obviously, the Debunking series is going to continue, but I've noticed that my own disposition in the videos has calmed over time, since when the comments come in with so much negative energy, that naturally is going to come back, whereas now most comments are kind of in on the debunking. And I can say the majority of them are based around a genuine misunderstanding. I see many of the people I respond to in the new videos reply acknowledging how they were wrong. Now obviously there's always going to be some really nasty outliers, which will continue getting clowned on in the videos, but I think the overall narrative has really shifted. I'm glad I got to finally tackle DIO's Coffin all in one place, and this one has been a long time coming. I've done the same sort of thing before in my videos on King Crimson or more recently Star Platinum's Time Stop, but this one was a lot more difficult just because of how varied and complex the arguments are. If there's another big JoJo topic you think would be good to cover like this, let me know in the comments below. If you want to stay updated on new videos, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. You can also join the Beat Discord to be notified on new uploads and any important JoJo news. Finally, I'd appreciate if you help support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Your support is what makes it possible for me to make these videos full-time. All supporters are featured in the credits and can submit viewer questions. This video's question comes from Solo Patello. They ask, have I traveled anywhere to see a JoJo event? Well, unfortunately, I haven't really had the chance to do that yet. There were a couple of JoJo World pop-ups in America that I could have visited, but I ended up learning they were pretty small in scale. The closest thing I did get to do was play the demo for All-Star Battle R at Anime Expo back in 2022, so I could have also gone to the Steel Ball Run event at this year's Anime Expo, but that place is a bit too crowded for me. Another pop-up tour of the JoJo World is actually coming around again in October, so I may visit that one. If you want to submit a question, you can do it by becoming a patron or member at any tier. On Patreon, you can post it in the community chat located on the left side of the site, or through a direct message. And on YouTube, you can leave it as a comment under the members-only community post. I try to answer one question in each of my main videos, so feel free to ask as many as you want. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up supporters. Thank you to Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Pumpkin Doge, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Christian McDonough, Pulse Dog, Rob Goliath, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Zenkai, Keenan, Saint Bobo, John Garcia, Crank and Plank, Fran Studios, Shin Megami Tensei Film Reviews, Griffiono, Fiddlehead, Justice, Joao Marchins, Danilo K, Kali, Javier's Milk, Billy the Corgi, Time Lord, Moist Daddy Tom, Daisuke, Artist 9398, Monkey 15, Conti Goat, Holy Peanut, Negef, Pluto of Pluto, As 2004K, Tony Was Alive, Trankrom, and Slushed Zero.